Are we truly at a turning point? And if so, which way is this thing turning?
I think it's a turning point of sorts, perhaps not quite what the Washington Post is suggesting, which I think may be something else. But let's talk a little bit about this conflict, which has evolved considerably over the last 7 months. Conflicts are not static. War is an ever-changing sea, if you will. And for the last 7 months, even though people in the West will never, ever admit it, the truth is that President Putin has exercised enormous restraint with regard to the use of his military power. We've never seen more than 20% of the Russian ground force in Ukraine. And most of the regular Russian ground force was subsequently withdrawn after the first 4 months, during which the Ukrainian army that we built over several years was largely destroyed. What you have in Ukraine now is a mix of various volunteer organizations, militias, some allied forces like the Chechens, Kuban Cossack volunteer organizations. They've turned out to be very good fighters, plus the Wagner mercenary group. It's also turned out to be very effective on the ground. But the real Russian army, with its combat forces, has largely pulled out of the fight. I thought they would come back in August, but apparently the decision was made not to do that. And what's happened now, I think, in the Kremlin is that Mr. Putin and his advisors have all concluded there's no chance of negotiating an end to this conflict. I think he really clung to that hope, even in the middle of April, when it was clear that we in London would not permit Zelensky and Kyiv to make any sort of a compromise, to accept neutrality, for instance, off the table. So now we're dealing with a different Russia. And what you saw yesterday in 3 waves were 202 missiles and loitering munitions attacking specific targets all over Ukraine. This is something that they've always been able to do. They have the precision-guided munitions and missiles, just as we do. This time, they not only hit so-called critical infrastructure, they also hit the secret police headquarters of the Ukrainian state, which is a notorious organization engaged in murdering people and forcing people into enemy gunfire at gunpoint, recruiting at gunpoint. But they also hit a number of analyst cells, places where people are putting together intelligence pictures. In other words, they've signaled that there's nothing happening in Western Ukraine that Moscow doesn't know about. And they've also signaled there's nothing over there they can't reach and destroy. So I think we're seeing a glimpse of what's going to happen later on this fall, which I predict will be major offensives on the ground once the soil freezes. That's coming. And this will be much closer to what a lot of us thought would happen at the very beginning. Massive offensives designed to utterly annihilate what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces.
The Western media is trying to paint these Russian airstrikes, these attacks, as inconsequential. That they're not really hurting Ukraine. I've heard this from a few propaganda mainstream media outlets over the past 24 hours. And I'm just going through the laundry list of targets. I mean, hitting Polish forces that were amassed and ready to invade Russia proper, hitting NATO targets, hitting, as you mentioned, the SBU, hitting thermal power plants. There are people who are fleeing Ukraine in droves right now because they have no fresh water, they have no running water, they have no electricity, they have no internet. So the Western media says these attacks were inconsequential. Ukraine's fine. What do you say to that?
President Biden apparently felt compelled to call, or at least his handlers felt compelled to have President Biden call Mr. Zelensky, reassure him that we will continue to supply him, that we back him, there will be no change. And at the same time, Mr. Zelensky pleaded with more air defense systems because the Russian attacks also destroyed 80% of Ukrainian air defenses. So if someone is suggesting this was not consequential, we have to look at those developments and we rapidly conclude, no, that's wrong. Mr. Zelensky is in a panic, unquestionably. They've got serious logistical problems moving things around in the country. Suddenly, Russia has decided enough is enough. We're not going to exercise the restraint we have in the past.
Talking about the air defense system specifically, Ukrainian President Zelensky, as you mentioned, just asked for more weapons. just asked for specifically air defense weapons. The U.S. appears to be going along with it. The United States throwing their support, happy always to supply weapons wherever they are needed. What will this do for Ukraine? Air defense systems. Explain how those would work and who would man. Are they unmanned? Would these be NATO soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers who would be manning these air defense systems?
Well, keep in mind that the so-called HIMARS system, which is this high mobility rocket system, is largely manned by so-called contractors.
Right.
Presumably, that consists of Americans in civilian clothes working on contract for the Ukrainian government via some other mechanism that we've created. Could also be Europeans. But these systems take a long time to learn how to operate, let alone maintain. Now, something called NASAMS, which is a surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missile system designed to protect point targets with a very complex radar system, it's one of the best in the world, was in Kyiv, and it's being destroyed. The way you overwhelm point air defense systems is that you launch lots of missiles and rockets. And eventually you're going to overwhelm any system, regardless of how good it is. That's what the Russians did in this operation. They targeted air defense sites and overwhelmed them. So, yes, Mr. Zelensky wants more of these, but then he's also got to have contractors operate them because his soldiers are not trained to do it.
So where do NATO forces play in the rest of this? Now, if we talk about this turning point, this decimation of the Ukrainian military, I've heard, you talk about this before, but you're eliminating their best soldiers, whatever's left of the Ukrainian military as they're being drawn out, they're being eliminated. To replace them is not easy, and arguably, I guess you're replacing them with NATO soldiers or contractors. Who's going to fill the, who's going to man the ship once the rest of the Ukrainian army is destroyed?
Well, the people engaged in direct fire combat on the ground are Ukrainians. Now, there are reports of large numbers of Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform making up for losses that occurred over the last few months. Because, as you point out, most of Ukrainians' best forces are gone. They've been killed or wounded. Ukrainians have lost roughly 100,000 dead, perhaps 2, 3, even 400,000 wounded.
Wow.
They started out with an army of 600,000. Remember, we spent 8 years building this army up with the express purpose of attacking Russia. That's what it was designed to do. That's why the Russians attacked it. And ultimately, we wanted to put missiles into eastern Ukraine with which we could threaten Russia. So again, eastern Ukraine had to be neutralized, and that's why the Russians intervened. But the Russians, as I pointed out earlier, have always exercised great restraint because, first of all, this is another Slavic country, another Orthodox Christian Slavic country. They're not interested in killing large numbers of people. They didn't want to destroy a lot of infrastructure. The areas where Russian forces are sitting in southern and eastern Ukraine were already Russian. They simply wanted to guarantee equal rights for the Russians in Ukraine with other Ukrainian citizens. That was the point of the Minsk agreements, which were never honored. So the bottom line is, at this point, you're looking at cannon fodder. People without much training being rounded up, put into uniform, handed an AK-47, put behind machine guns, whatever else, put into tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Do they get training? Some have had good training, but the vast majority haven't had much. So the casualties have been very high. But once you move above the tactical level and you move up to what we would call division or corps levels, you find NATO staffs are actually running the show. In other words, people from France, Great Britain, the United States, other countries are doing the systematic planning and setting forth proposals for what should happen next.
Right.
There's a lot of evidence that the Ukrainian president has not taken our advice very well, and he's determined to attack, largely because I think he sees himself in a position where he has everything to lose and not much more to gain. So he thinks he can wear down the Russians. The problem is, for every one Russian killed or wounded, you have 5, 6, or 7 Ukrainians being killed or wounded. So for the Russians, they've economized. They've run a fairly cheap, inexpensive defense, while the Ukrainians have run very expensive offenses.